So excited to kick off this conference with our very first keynote, who is Dr. Mary Gray. Dr. Mary Gray is a principal researcher at Microsoft Research and a faculty affiliate at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center. Dr. Gray also maintains affiliations at Indiana University. Dr. Gray is known to many of us. She's done groundbreaking work on how people's everyday uses of technology transform labor, they transform identity and human rights. And in 2020, many of us were very excited to see Dr. Gray named as a MacArthur Fellow for her contributions in this area. And, a lot of her work is not going to be sort of news to you all, but I think that Dr. Gray is going to be covering some new work and new line of thinking that she's been doing over the past several years. And we're very excited to see that. And I also want to mention that sort of on a personal note, it's really a huge pleasure for me to see Dr. Gray giving this talk and to launch our conference because she was one of my very first mentors in this space of technology and inequality. And I know that this is something that she cherishes and values and has done for many sort of junior scholars in this area. And so she's been a guide to many of us in exploring this area, and we're very excited to see what she's been thinking about over the past couple of years and to launch our conference. And with that, I'll hand over the mic to you.
Oh, it is such my pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation to join you and to present to you today. I'm going to do my best not to speak quickly, to cram everything in. And the work that I want to share with you today is actually new work in collaboration with some colleagues at Microsoft Research. And it's my attempt to think through what are the possibilities and ultimately the constraints on developing technologies for social needs and social demands, and more importantly, to think about justice as a priority when we're imagining the design of these technologies and the markets that follow. So this is joint work with colleagues at Microsoft Research, Daniel Feldman, Calvin Leong, Catherine Lowe, who are working with me this year. And also a group I'm calling the North Carolina Project Resolve Tech Coalition. This is a number of community-based organizations in North Carolina who have been on the ground doing community healthcare work. I want to feature their work and the collaborations that we're doing together to think about this topic of more than fair. And I called it this because I want to think through what it means that we've begun so much of the work of thinking about equity with a call to fairness. And I want to acknowledge that's a really powerful place to start, but what can we do to push past a fairly, I would say, under-theorized notion of what it means to bring equity to technology development and the markets, again, that follow in digital technologies. So the structure of my talk today is going to organize around sharing a very specific example of a lack of fairness in design. And it's to feature some work that was actually uncovered by some researchers at the University of California, Berkeley in 2019. And the next place I want to take us is into a conversation about why would it be so difficult to de-bias data, to have de-biasing be the focus of finding justice in systems. And I want to make the case that in many ways, and I'm absolutely building on the work of Sasha Costanza-Chock here, as well as Kimberly Crenshaw, decades before us, who think about the limits of imagining the kind of discrete categories of demographics or identity that we tend to hope are the sources of finding equilibrium or creating justice through attending to discrete pieces of our identity. And then lastly, I want to suggest if we reject this idea of kind of discrete categories of identity as the proper objects or objective functions to create equality, and look at a different paradigm, like what does it look like to stop looking for measurements that show us something that flattens difference and shift to thinking about what it looks like to accept that difference is a part of the social landscape and something to build for rather than against. And I want to use this Project Resolve as a case of that, and hopefully offer you a replacement for talking about scaling as a marker of success. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the references. My thinking has been deeply informed by the scholars that you see here on the screen. And probably most notably, Sasha is driving a lot of my thinking here. But I would say that she is, in all senses of the word, showing the deep roots of Black feminist thinkers in all of the critiques that we're offering around what's possible in this space of searching for fairness. And again, what will fall short when we use that as the measurement of success. The other scholars you see on the screen are thinkers that I've been very influenced by, precisely because they reject the notion of a principled approach to fairness and push for a practice of constant power negotiation and recognizing the systemic structures of oppression that we are always engaging when we're optimistically building for the world. And that's a good thing, like how to accept the challenge of constantly calling the question on the constraints of our capacity to, as any individual knows, to create change alone. So foundational to all of the sites I just gave you is Kimberly Crenshaw's notion of intersectionality. And I want to dwell for a second on her definition. And this is from the African American Policy Forum that is using her 1989 definition. And intersectionality as a way of thinking about why is debiasing data and striving for measurements of fairness such a challenging task is a way of unlocking a new path. If we think about intersectionality conceptually, this is a theoretical framework to look at how discrimination is a set of systems. Really think of the layers, the detritus of many, many centuries of different ways in which people are pushed to the center or margins of society, but it's the piling up of those different systems that we're often contending with when we're trying to build technologies that serve society. We're never just one identity. We are always multifaceted in the way in which we are expressing who we are and how we're seen by others. And it's that really fundamental social insight, accepting the reality that none of us are really atomized sets of characteristics that can be tucked into columns in a database, that could drive where we go with how we think about these interlocking systems of oppression that weigh differently on each of us, depending on where we are in the world, quite literally, not just who we are in the world, but where we are in the world. And that matters a great deal when we're thinking about building technologies that until today have often sought to scale past the realities of these different interlocking systems that shape our experience of the day-to-day. So with this notion of intersectionality in mind, I want to point out that probably I don't need to say to any of you, COVID has made it quite clear that these interlocking systems play out in healthcare. These interlocking systems that mean someone of a specific gender or race, ethnicity, where they live in the world, all of those things combined affect how they've been cared for or overlooked in the pandemic. And I think it's important to note that this was absolutely true. COVID just showed us in stark reality that disparity in the United States. But just the year prior, and probably lost in the news because of the pandemic, we had a pretty substantial call out of one of the diagnostic systems used in hospitals across the United States for what's called risk scoring for hospital bed placement for admissions. In 2019, headlines like this were littering the news. And it was quite clear that, like the ProPublica studies before it that showed risk scores used in criminal justice systems meant for being able to predict recidivism to be able to replace a judge's making that decision, that the same sorts of challenges of building systems without attending to both intersectionality and systemic oppression will reproduce the kinds of biases that are circulating in the world, that it couldn't help but do that. So this is just a collection of the call out of this reality. Importantly, and let's break down what Obermeyer and colleagues found in their study of what later they revealed was Optum. What they found was that the algorithm was predicting risk scores for patients, but that there was a disparity between Black and white patients who were admitted based on this algorithmic risk score. And unless we would accept that there was some biological difference between the health of Black and white patients in some fundamental way, we have to account for why there would be such a difference in who's admitted. So when Obermeyer and colleagues dug into and in many ways reverse engineered how the risk score was managed, it was clear the predictions, the modeling was including information about medical costs. It was using medical costs and basically who's admitted to a hospital as a prior for and a proxy of medical need. Now, pointing that out in hindsight, it makes it seem quite obvious that that is why we had the disparity between the admission of Black and white patients. But Obermeyer was able to kind of recreate this bias by showing that Black patients should have been admitted more. And I would argue their correction at the end of the paper as a place that tends to strike the chord of fairness is perhaps not the place to stop. That in many ways they suggest new algorithms that are focused on health per year, total cost per year, and avoidable cost per year. Finding more information would somehow balance out and help correct this fundamental systemic oppression that Black patients face when they're not admitted to the hospital. In other words, there's a sense that on paper in modeling, you can greatly reduce this racial disparity by adding more information into the model. But the challenge of this is that it fails to account for what will always fall out of the model. So we're going to be perpetually searching for more and more information as a way of debiasing our models. But in fact, it never gets us closer to fully accepting that information isn't the source of the discrepancy. It is the actions of somebody making a snap decision about who's coming into the emergency room and who should be seen first or who should be pushed to the bottom of a chart. So there's no system that isn't going to be constantly interacting with the presence of these other forms of tacit societal bias that are channeled through all of us as individuals. So my argument to you today, and I'm going to move more quickly because I want to make sure we get to discussion. My argument is rather than continue to search for more information as a balance to the model, would be let's shift to looking at how would we constantly build a model that is iterative and gauging the domain and subject matter expertise of people closest to that moment to be able to use our predictive models to surface what's the prediction one could make, and what is it that somebody could surface that tells them what bias they're working with in that moment. How would we use models to help us identify our biases? And then we can negotiate that bias, not try and override it with the system, but literally flood ourselves with that awareness. So what would that look like? I want to present to you what Project Resolve for me allows us to do by focusing on building a system that is closer to the subject matter experts who can constantly help us understand what is unfair about a system, who have the perspective that when we're just flooding a model with information is lost in the mix. So if you think about community healthcare workers, they have effectively become this translational bridge to COVID care. They are the ones that surface who's overlooked. More so than a model, they're constantly using their priors with the subject matter expertise they have to be able to fine-tune how they meet people's needs. So I'm going to make a case as I go, but the goal is not to scale past these community health organizers, these community healthcare workers, but rather to center their care in the thick of the support of a range of clients, but particularly those who are best served by communities who quite literally speak their language. For example, when we talked with a long-term healthcare worker, they noted in most cases, by the time somebody gets to a hospital, they might be able to tell you what somebody's labs look like. But as they said, they don't know that somebody's about to lose their house. It's that kind of subject matter expertise that a community healthcare worker brings to their analyses of whether somebody needs a bed or not. And in other cases, when we're talking with administrators, they're quite aware of the power of their position, their intersectionality with the clients, that their position as somebody who's been in the place of somebody calling for help makes all the difference in their ability to interpret the moment of need that is coming through the phone in this case. But whenever they're presented with somebody who's in need, that they're bringing another set of qualitative data to the table that can't be folded into a model. But the tools that are built for these community healthcare workers are not designed to support their relationships with these clients and with communities. And it took working with well over 14 different community organizations to be able to get a sense of what is the range of care that they provide across these intersections. So when we're listening to these community healthcare workers, we're hearing that they're actually operating on two different levels constantly. On one level, they're managing this case-centric care. They're caring for individuals in an acute moment of need, but they're also constantly thinking about a service level provision of care that's at the community level, where they're thinking about classes that are going to serve that client once they're out of a particularly acute situation. They're thinking about the advocacy that that person's going to need, and they're collaborating with other community-based organizations to meet that holistic care need that's quite literally taking in the intersectionality of the client, that it's not just an individual, it's a person in a setting who is part of a group and actually part of many identities as women or non-binary people, who are people of color, who are undocumented, that it takes this level of detail of understanding the context of a person in need to be able to serve them fully. So one example of this kind of service-centric care that community-based organizations offer is through vaccine clinics, for example. They don't know who's going to come through the doors to receive a vaccine, but they do have a better sense than any clinic that's waiting for somebody to come in the door. What kind of translation help will be necessary? Do they need to have more people who quite literally speak a different language or know the food and dietary restrictions and needs with particular religious groups. That is the kind of subject matter expertise these community healthcare workers can bring to the table, not to debias the experience of providing this care, but quite literally to be constantly iterating on what's the fine tuning of the care that's necessary in this situation. So their ability to do this work is sitting inside these larger sets of relationships with funders, certainly with clinical care in hospitals and with other community partners. They are negotiating and building this bridge to people who are otherwise excluded. They know, and we learned through this project, that they can't make any particular impact without being the ones who actually control the data that's collected about clients. So right now, most of the information they're building, the data we need to understand and build the trust with the clients who are most marginalized by society, are in need of tools that actually let them control and, to their argument, harness the power of learning from these clients every day. So I want to quickly show you a few screenshots of the things that we've built, because I don't think these tools are anything other than a first try at what it means to design with communities. And quite honestly, the shortcomings and constraints on doing that within an industry setting. So we've built with them to their spec to address their pain points, what kind of intake form would help them manage the data they need to both provide that patient or case-centric care and service-centric care. But it's built specifically to create relationships with their clients and with the other community-based organizations. The workflows that they have are most critical when it's 2 or 3 different community-based organizations that are serving different parts of different facets of a person's identity. For example, in cases where we were working with a community-based organization that serves women who are just returning citizens who are also new parents, being able to have that community-based organization work with another organization that specifically helps with food insecurity means that the broader needs of these individuals can be tended to. But importantly, the technology isn't going to scale past these social dynamics. It's the social dynamics of working in relationship to existing hospital systems that are not built for daily use by people who don't have a primary care physician. It's dealing with the social dynamics of different friction points between community groups that maybe sit side by side, but are divided by racism, by homophobia, by other forms of oppression that divide and conquer all of us. And these key dynamics are precisely what the community healthcare workers work with as they're navigating how to care for the clients who come to them in need of help. I would argue that we're designing differently and building differently. Again, hat tip to Sasha for thinking through what this could look like, and to all the scholars who are thinking about what it means to design with communities and with groups, setting the agendas. But it's going to look really different than what scaling is supposedly doing. It means not thinking about paying customers. It means literally thinking about the subject matter expertise of the clients themselves and the community groups in this case, so that we're not thinking that we're imagining what might be good for someone else, but quite literally asking them what are their needs, and more importantly, what are the solutions they're already incorporating into how they navigate these systems. So I want to give you a really clear example of how hard this is, because I see failure within the system we've built. We created categories for gender, for example, and we ended up reproducing the kind of binaries that are so typical when gathering data. the only thing that makes us, gives me any solace, having recreated the same possibility of producing biased data, meaning that it's only capturing a binary, is because we are in constant conversation with these community groups so that they can help us redesign this intake form and think about what is a meaningful structure to gender for their organizations. How can they collectively have the conversation about what categories of identity are important for them? And that includes the other categories that you see on this screen. Because at the end of the day, whenever we're collecting data, we're going to be reproducing categories. It's right now, we don't have a system and a way of thinking systemically about intersectionality. That's what I would bring to this conference, is how can we approach the mathematical need for identifying ways to model intersectionality. And perhaps it looks like a different kind of mathematics that isn't as attached to thinking about a quantitative, discrete category of identity. What would that look like? I want to make a case that it's modeling something I'm calling scaffolding. This is actually building on cognitive theories from the early 1900s around learning theory. That scaffolding rather than scaling might be a way of imagining how we either work with or move through the ways in which we create discrete categories. It looks specifically like using subject matter expertise to constantly be the source of course correction, and not toward finding all of the right information, but rather constantly bringing to our attention what and who are we missing. It's the subject matter expert. In the case of Project Resolve, that's community healthcare workers and community-based organizations who are in the best position to be able to collectively say, who are we missing? What dimension of humanity is missing from our care, from our analysis? But the piece I think is often left out that I want to argue as I'm closing out our conversation that we're missing is disciplinary domain expertise. That's what I love about this conference and why I'm so excited that you've convened it. Because to me, the most important thing we can be doing now is working as multidisciplinary teams that build bridges and broker power, and in many ways yield agendas to subject matter experts. How do we, instead of trying to have the CS expertise of software development, design, HCI, data sciences, security, economics, how do we, rather than have that domain, that subject or that domain expertise of CS just pass and connect to subject matter experts and miss the disciplinary domain expertise of social sciences? How would we instead be able to bring these different vantage points together to say they have very important perspectives that have to be put on the table toward the goal of prioritizing the identified needs and capabilities, to borrow from Sen, of the subject matter experts, so that we're constantly building with each other. And as importantly, acknowledging where there are power differentials that mean there is never a moment at which we're operating from an even playing field, that is an artifice. It's a liberal notion of liberation, that inequality that gets in our way from grappling with how hard it is to practice justice. So we should know that technology isn't going to create some systemic change in and of itself. But what if we were focused on building new relationships that were going to be this constant course correction, not with a particular goal in mind, but really the means of that relationship, the process of it being our objective. So with that, I want to thank the organizers, all of you. Special thanks to my colleague, Elizabeth Federoff, for their help with this presentation. And if you want to see the open source software we've built with community-based organizations, you can go over to GitHub, or I can send you this link. Thank you.